פילוסופיה בזמן מלחמה. הרצאות פילוסופיות קצרות מפי מרצות ומרצים מכלל קהילת הפילוסופיה בישראל, העוסקות בשאלות הצפות בימים אלו, ימי מלחמה ומשבר. האזנה נעימה.
רציונליות וצריכת חדשות. האם כדי להיות רציונליים בנוגע לסוגיה כלשהי, יש לבחון את כל הראיות כולן? האם בעת מלחמה רציונלי לצפות כל הזמן בחדשות? על שאלות אלו ידבר איתנו היום פרופסור ליבנס מהחוג לפילוסופיה באוניברסיטת חיפה. ההרצאה הפעם תהיה באנגלית.
Hello and welcome to this audio lecture. My name is Samuel Lebens. I'm a Professor Yadber of philosophy at the University of Haifa. And I want to start with just two apologies. The first is that I'm speaking to you in English rather than in Hebrew, and I hope that won't put too many of you off. The second apology is that I'm not really going to speak to you about anything that I've published on or any of my main areas of research, because I thought it was more important in this series of lectures that Dan Barras and Arnon Karen are putting together from amongst Israel's philosophy lecturers and teachers. I thought it was more important for this series to focus on something that may feel pertinent and relevant to us. So with those apologies out of the way, I'll explain some of the context of why I wanted to talk about this issue and indeed what this issue actually is. On the 7th of October, I am an observant Jew, so I'm Shomer Mitzvot, and what that amounts to is that on the 7th of October, because it was a Chag, and indeed it was Shabbat anyway, we weren't listening to the news. We didn't have our phones on, we didn't have the television on. Even so, rumors were beginning to spread. I was spending the day in Yerushalayim, with my family, so we spent a lot of time in an air raid shelter, so clearly we knew that things were not all right, but we didn't know exactly what had gone on. And then the experience was when Shabbat went out, finding this deluge of information, tragic, shocking, catastrophic indeed, information, heartbreaking information. And then I had the experience, and I think this might resonate with a lot of listeners, whatever one's feelings about the situation and however one may have reacted. I think that it sent most of us into a spiral of news consumption. I think at the best of times, we spend a lot of time consuming news and information. That is a feature of this information age in which we live, in which the internet is always around us. We don't go anywhere without our smartphones, and we get regular updates as to the state of the world and what's going on around us. But even so, even though that is a ubiquitous feature of life in this 21st century, the sensation of that first week after the 7th of October was almost total immersion in the news. I couldn't break myself free from looking at updates every moment. What's happening, how many people have, God forbid, been killed and how many have been injured, and what's the Israeli reaction going to be, and how's the Israeli reaction taking shape, and what is the international reaction, and what's going on in Gaza, and what's going on in the West Bank, and what's going on, etc., etc. And then we had our first Shabbat, 7 days later, a week later, where I had to detox from all news and information. And this has led me to think about a question that had come up in some of my teaching at the University of Haifa. But again, like I said in my apologies at the beginning, not notions that I had researched in any depth or published about. Nonetheless, the question that I'm going to be asking, as I said, is a question that had come up from time to time in some of my teaching. And the question is it always good to know stuff? That's to say, is this thirst we have for knowledge about the news in this particular instance good for us? Or perhaps we want to know too much. Is there such a thing as knowing too much. Now, there are two philosophers who articulate really well the idea, and I think it's probably an intuitive idea for anybody who loves philosophy. They articulate the idea that basically, in a sense, although it's a little bit more complicated, the idea is that knowledge is always good. It's always good to know. To dispel ignorance is perhaps the primary good of research and of study, the life of the mind, philosophy in general. Two thinkers I'm thinking of who articulate this particularly well are John Locke, the early modern British philosopher, in his essay concerning human understanding. He writes the following. This is in Book 2, Chapter 21. He says, "He that judges without informing himself to the utmost that he is capable cannot acquit himself of judging amiss." Now, even though that was English, I'll translate it into a slightly, I hope, easier English to grasp. What he's saying is that, in a sense, you don't have a right to form an opinion until you have found as much information as you are capable of amassing to inform your judgment. So again, you basically don't have a right to form an opinion until you have informed yourself with as much information that's relevant to the opinion at hand. And if you haven't done that, if you haven't done the utmost of which you are capable, that's the language that Locke uses, if you haven't done the utmost of what you are capable of doing in order to amass all of the relevant evidence that might shape your opinion, then if it turns out that your opinion is wrong, you only have yourself to blame, right? That's what Locke is saying. Now, years later, in the 20th century, the great analytic philosopher Rudolf Carnap formulated a principle. It comes up, for instance, in his Logical Foundations of Probability. He comes up with a principle called the requirement of total evidence. The requirement of total evidence. So his basic idea is that it's only ever reasonable to act if the evidence suggests that the action in question is the best action available to you. So where Locke was talking about forming opinions, and he says, look, you don't have a right to form an opinion until you've educated yourself with as much relevant information as you're capable of amassing. Carnap is talking not just about forming opinions, he's talking about acting in the world, doing stuff. And he says, it's never reasonable to perform an action unless you have amassed as much evidence as you possibly can to inform you as to whether or not this is going to be a wise action to perform, right? So again, his basic idea is that it's only ever reasonable to act if the evidence suggests that the action in question is the best action available to you in your given situation, given your aims and objectives. Moreover, the evidence that you have can only reasonably play this role if it amounts to all of the relevant evidence that you were able to gather, right? So basically, look, Carnap recognizes, sometimes we have to act in an emergency and you might not have time to gather reams and reams of information and evidence in order to educate yourself as to whether this action you're going to perform is going to be the right one or the wrong one. So he's saying, okay, but as much evidence as you reasonably can amount in the time that you have, you should amount, right? Get as much evidence as you reasonably possibly can to inform your decision making. And if you don't do that, then chances are you will be acting irrationally. So again, this is called the requirement of total evidence. So both of these principles, Locke's idea that you shouldn't form any opinion until you're as educated as you possibly can be about the subject matter, and Carnap's requirement of total evidence, which says you really shouldn't perform any actions without being as informed as you were reasonably possibly able to be informed as to whether the action that you're going to perform will be successful, will be a wise action in furthering your own aims and objectives. Now, when I'm saying in the aftermath of October the 7th that, well, maybe I'm reading too much news. Maybe this isn't good for me. Maybe I don't need to know quite as much as I am informing myself about. And I suppose Locke and Carnap would be saying to me, no, Sam, if you're going to have opinions, right, surely you plan to vote in the next Israeli election, for example, if you're going to have opinions about how this country should be run, how this country should or shouldn't defend itself, how this country should relate to the various international problems that it faces and the internal problems that it faces, if you're going to form opinions about that stuff, there is no amount of information that is too much. On the contrary, you should get as much information as you are possible of getting that could shape your opinions. So no, you're not watching the news too much. If anything, perhaps you're watching it too little. Likewise, there are various actions I might be called upon to make. Voting is just one of them, but in terms of where I volunteer, where I donate money, all sorts of actions, where the more I know about the various facts on the ground about the current conflict, let's say, the more my decisions will be informed and therefore wise and rational in conformity with Carnap's requirement of total evidence. Now, of course, like Carnap would recognize that I have other obligations in my life, other things I have to, other areas of life in which I have to act, as a parent, as a husband, as a teacher of philosophy, where if I spent all my time educating myself about this particular round of this particular conflict, I would be in dereliction of various duties that I have in other spheres of life. But nonetheless, all things being equal, there is no amount of knowledge on any given topic about which you may want to form opinions or about which you may want to act. There is no amount of knowledge which is in principle too much knowledge. Now, where this has come up so far in my own teaching is, and I'm sorry to be talking about such cheerful topics, but I teach a course on the philosophy of death. And the course is largely modelled on a very popular philosophy course on the philosophy of death that's taught by Shelley Kagan at Yale University in America. Kagan's entire lecture series was uploaded to YouTube and is indeed a very popular lecture series, and I advise people, if they're interested in listening to philosophy online, as you are doing right now, Kagan's lecture series is very good, and indeed the lecture series was also written up as a book. The book is called, imaginatively, Death. The place in which this topic emerges in Kagan's discussion of death is a chapter of the book in which he thinks about various reactions that people have to their own mortality, various reactions people have to the fact that they're going to die. And one of the reactions that some people have is just to put it out of their mind. They basically just try to ignore the fact that they're going to die. And you might think, now I don't think this is true, but you might think that what John Locke and Rudolf Carnap have to say about our obligation to be informed, you might think that what they have to say about that topic undermines the desire to be ignorant, undermines the desire to ignore facts, for instance, about your own mortality. Now, Kagan disagrees. He thinks that it's not always unreasonable to ignore facts. And I think you'll see as we develop the thought further, I think Carnap and Locke might be able to come along some of the way with Kagan in accepting that maybe sometimes it's reasonable to ignore certain facts. Kagan suggests it depends what facts you're ignoring and why. Okay, and to illustrate this point, he tells a few stories. So I want you to imagine that you're about to go on a date with, so let's imagine if you're not single, imagine that you are single. You're about to go on a date with a very attractive person. I don't know, you've met them on Tinder or whatever it is where people meet people these days. And you've read their profile and they look really interesting and the picture attracts you and the conversation you've had online so far attracts you and you're quite excited about going on this first date. And just as you're about to go leave your house for this exciting date, an envelope appears at your feet. And what you're told is that inside this envelope is a letter. In the letter, there is the report of a fact that if you knew this fact, you wouldn't want to go on the date. You are assured that if you read the contents of this letter, you would no longer want to go on the date. Should you open the envelope or should you ignore it? Okay. Or if you prefer, think of a different scenario, but similar. There's a really lovely looking toute de banane fruit smoothie on your table, and you're just about, it's really refreshing and cold and lovely, and you're just about to bring the glass to your lips when an envelope appears on the table, and you're told reliably that the contents of the envelope would convince you not to drink the fruit smoothie. Do you open the envelope or not? The idea that we're getting at in these scenarios is the question, look, if there are facts that would change your mind about how to behave, and you know that they would change your mind because you've been told reliably, look, I promise you, if you read what's in this envelope, you will change your mind about something. You'll change your mind about going on the date, or you'll change your mind about drinking the smoothie, right? How could it ever be rational to disregard them? And again, you're hearing the force of John Locke, you're hearing the force of Rudolf Carnap in that very question. But Kagan helps us to see that the question needs to be clarified somewhat. And he helps us to see that, I think, with a third scenario. So imagine you've gone on the date and it's all gone very well and you've fallen deeply in love and you're about to kiss this person, okay? Maybe not even for the first kiss, but you're about to kiss them. There's a moment of romance has swept you both up and you're about to lean in for a passionate kiss. But just as you're leaning in, lo and behold, an envelope appears right between you, and you're told that inside this envelope is a letter, and the letter will say something, and I promise you, if you read this letter, you will change your mind about kissing her. Should you read the letter? Well, what Kagan asks us to think about is this. Well, hold on a minute. Do the facts in question give you a reason to change your behavior? Or do they simply cause you to change your behavior? What's the difference? Again, you could change your behavior because you've been given a reason to change your behavior, or you could change your behavior because you've been caused to change your behavior. And the third scenario, the one of the kiss, is going to help us to understand this distinction, I think, really well. Because let's imagine that what's in the letter is something like this. A vivid description of the physiology of kissing about the exchange of saliva and the rubbing of tongues and lips and oral hygiene and dental facts or whatever it might be. Or let's say that what's in the letter is a vivid description of your lover's last bowel movements, the last time they went to the toilet, perhaps with photographic evidence of what they produced. Now, thinking about those things, okay, the physiology of kissing or your lover's last bowel movements, those thoughts may cause you no longer to want to kiss a person. But just because they've kind of broken the mood, okay, they've caused you no longer to feel so romantic. But they haven't really given you a reason to change your behaviour. After all, you knew that kissing has a physiology. You knew that your beloved goes to the toilet, right? These weren't things you didn't know. It's just that by being confronted with those facts in that moment, you're caused to act differently. And I suppose the reason you're caused to act differently is because you are caused to feel differently. But you haven't been given any new reasons to change your behaviour. It's not like there's an argument in there that kissing would somehow be inappropriate at this moment, or that this person isn't really worthy of your love and affection. So if you go back to the other cases, right, if what was in the envelope was something that would merely cause you to change your behaviour, rather than something that would merely would actually give you a reason to change your behaviour, then perhaps it's smart to avoid opening the envelope. Again, it depends. Are the facts that you are ignoring facts that give you a reason to change your behaviour? Or are they somehow facts that perhaps even you know them already, but you're not paying attention to them right now? And the reason you're not paying attention to them right now is that they would cause you to change your behaviour. Think, for example, of this. Let's imagine that you're about to go on that first date and somebody tells you a really horrible habit that this person has. I'm sorry to make this vulgar, but I think it's good to have examples in mind so you know the sort of thing I'm talking about. So let's pretend that you're told that the person that you're about to go on a date with has this disgusting habit of biting their toenails, okay? And all in all, you know, that might be a deeply undesirable character trait or behavior pattern. That might be, in a sense, a reason not to want to go on a date with this person. On the other hand, there may be so many other reasons to go on the date. It might well be that this person is absolutely compatible with you, you know, more than just compatible with you. It might be that this person is, of all people in the world, the best match for you, such that if you got together, the happiness and the romance and the significance and the love that you would develop together with this person would be unparalleled as compared to any other person you may go on a date with. And yet, it could still be the fact that it's pretty horrible that they bite their toenails, right? Now, I would suggest that in this case, knowing that they bite their toenails, if you don't know all of these other facts, would seem to give you a reason to change your behaviour, because it really is, it truly is a nasty fact about them. But the only reason it would change your behaviour is because you don't know all of the other wonderful stuff about them. Then again, I would suggest that this is a case in which deep down what's really going on is you are being caused to change your behaviour rather than being given really a reason to change your behaviour. You should go on that date. You just get over it. Okay, you found out one nasty thing about them, but there might be, you know, an infinite number of wonderful things about them that completely outweigh this bad thing. And perhaps anyway, you'll be able to convince them over time to change their pedicure habits. So in a nutshell, this is Kagan's conclusion. Well, I say in a nutshell, I'm going to quote him. He says the following: "I'm inclined to think that the right position here is a moderate one. There are times and places for thinking about the facts of death. When you're kissing somebody, that's not the time and that's not the place. So if someone says that you should always have the facts of your mortality before your mind's eye, then I think they're mistaken. Similarly, though, if anybody says that you should never think about mortality and the nature of death, I think that they're mistaken as well. There is, in fact, a time and a place. What I want to take from Kagan here is just this notion that there's a time and a place for knowing stuff, a time and a place for finding out facts, and a time and a place for perhaps putting inquiry to one side. Now, does this strictly contradict what we supposedly learned from Locke and Carnap? No, not strictly speaking. Remember, John Locke says that before you form an opinion, you should inform yourself as fully as you possibly can. Well, Kagan could possibly agree with that. So, if you need to form an opinion about how best to act in the face of your mortality, for example, you better well find out all of the facts you possibly can that may shape your opinion, not cause your opinion to be different, right? We're looking for facts that will inform you, that would give you new reasons, but you should look for them. Likewise, Carnap says before you act in a certain way, you should get as many reasons as you're able to get. You should accumulate as much evidence. And again, we're talking about evidence. That's to say things which give you new reasons, not things which merely cause you, by manipulating your emotions, let's say, cause you to act differently. No, Carnap's interested in your amounting as much evidence. That's to say as many good reasons to inform your decision-making patterns. But I think Kagan can agree with both Locke and Carnap. But the point is, there's a time and a place. There's a time and a place for forming an opinion about a matter. And there's a time and a place to say, oh, do you know what? I'm going to form my opinion about this a little bit later because right now I have to make some spaghetti or whatever it might be, right? Likewise, with informing yourself about decision making, you can say, okay, that's a big decision. I'm going to inform myself about all the facts before I make that decision, but I don't have to make that decision until Tuesday, and I'm not going to spend all of my time thinking about it because I've got other stuff to do, right? There is a time and a place. So far, what Kagan has said is perhaps consistent with the Carnap and Locke with which we started. But I think things get a little bit more complicated. That's to say, Kagan has only suggested that there are times and places where it's appropriate to think about something, and times and places where it's inappropriate to think about something. What I'm going to share with you next is a chain of considerations which might lead you to think that there are some facts which it's never the time or place to think about, even though they might affect the way you act, not just by causing you to act differently, but even by giving you new reasons. So that's to say, I'm going to share with you a chain of considerations which I think if you will follow them, you'll actually be led into a much more direct conflict with Carnap and Locke than anything that Kagan generates. But before I share with you, and with that we'll conclude, before I share with you that chain of considerations, let me bring this back to the terrible events of October the 7th and all of the things that have been happening subsequent to that. I think we need to be clear to distinguish between accumulating new knowledge and just accumulating shocking imagery, let's say. For instance, I know that thousands of people in Gaza are dying, okay? And I know that before that, people were raped and mutilated and burnt alive and all sorts of horrific, inhuman sufferings were unleashed upon the people of the south of Israel in what's called the Gaza envelope. I know that. And I know about, generations of suffering and injustice on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict going back 75 years and more. I know. Do I need to see the photographs? Do I need to see the films? And I think that's a slightly different question to what Locke and Carnap would have had in mind. Well, of course, Locke was writing before there was such thing as video photography to begin with. But the idea is you can know something, and then you can see it with your own eyes, and you can see it in the gory technicolor detail. And I'd suggest that perhaps Locke and Carnap might say, if what's important for forming opinions is the knowledge, then you can get that knowledge through the written word. You can get that knowledge without necessarily seeing the horrible photography and film imagery. In fact, if anything, we should worry that because imagery and film bring us so close to the horrific details that they may affect our opinions and our actions in ways that are more like being caused rather than being given new reasons. But that's a little digression from the main topic of this lecture, but I think it follows from it. Kagan is right, I think, to note that sometimes facts give us new reasons to act. Sometimes exposure to facts just cause us to act in different ways or to feel different things, not necessarily because we've been provided with new reasons. And I think that distinction between reason and cause probably corresponds quite well, at least for many of us, between reading about news and seeing all of the photos and the videos and the audio files or whatever. There may be too much of an emotional overload. I'm not one who thinks that emotions cause us, or that emotions are inherently irrational. There are lots of people who think that. I'm not one of those people. I think that emotions are A, appropriate response to stimuli, and B, they play a role in shaping our reason and the life of the mind. Nonetheless, I do think that we can sometimes be overly swayed by emotions. And I think in this case, potentially, we should be on guard. Are these images we're seeing, are these videos we may be tempted to watch, are they going to give us new reasons to form different opinions? Are they going to give us new reasons to form different paths of actions? Or are they just going to overwhelm us emotionally, perhaps causing us ultimately to have opinions that are not necessarily the most reasoned, or to pursue courses of action which are not perhaps the most reasoned, but because we have allowed emotions to become overly decisive in these areas. But anyway, as I said, it's something of a tangent, but I thought I would throw it out. The chain of thought that I want to share with you before we leave comes from Edna Ullman Margalit, who was a fabulous Israeli philosopher who sadly passed away. She has a book called Normal Rationality, Decisions and Social Order, published by Oxford University Press. And in that book, she confronts Carnap and Locke. Let me give you one of her examples. Okay, I mean, one of her examples is at a time where where you might not want to know a fact that would give you a reason to act differently. Is you're about to watch a movie, and the movie has a twist at the end, and somebody tells you what that twist is. Well, that's really annoying, right? The movie has been spoiled for you. You may rather not know about the twist before you see the movie. And that's true, even though, had you known about the twist beforehand, you may not have wanted to have seen the movie, right? That's to say, there are facts about movies which, had you known them beforehand, may have given you reason not to watch the movie, and yet you don't want to know that fact beforehand, because on the off chance that the movie's going to be a good movie, you don't want anything to spoil it for you. That is, much more than Kagan's notion of there being a time and a place for concentrating on certain facts. Ullman Margulit's example of the twist in the movie, it really is a much more pertinent counterexample to Locke and more drastically even to Carnap, because Carnap's talking about facts that would change your behavior, facts that would change the decisions that you make. Had you known this fact beforehand, you would have decided not to see the film, and yet it was rational not to want to know it, because on the off chance that it was a good movie, you didn't want to have the movie spoiled for you. So that is a counterexample to Carnap, and it's worth thinking about. But I think, a better example she brings, and I'll tell you why I think it's better in a minute, is the following, and I'm quoting from her book. A defense attorney in a murder case may decide to avoid asking her client the direct question of whether or not he committed the crime. She will instead only ask him whether he wishes to plead guilty or not guilty. The attorney in such a case may say to herself, I don't want to know the answer to the question whether my client is guilty or innocent. She assesses that she will do a better and more professional job if she doesn't know whether or not she is defending an innocent person. Just to unpack this example a little better, there is such a thing called procedural justice. The idea of procedural justice is that it's important not only that guilty people, let's say, get punished and that innocent people don't get punished. It's also important that the correct procedures are followed in order to ascertain who is guilty and who is innocent and which punishment should be given to whom. The person who places a great deal of weight upon the procedures being done properly is somebody who cares about what we call procedural justice. So important is procedural justice to some people that they are willing to allow guilty people to be let off of any punishment whatsoever if the wrong procedures were followed. For example, in America, there's something called Miranda rights. These are the rights of the accused. One of them, famously, is that a criminal, or I should say somebody accused of criminality, has the right to remain silent. And if somebody who has been accused of a crime hasn't been told by the police who arrest them, let's say, that they have a right to remain silent, then the right procedures were not followed. And because of that, and so important is following the right procedures, judges would be willing to let the accused off, even if there's loads and loads of evidence that they're guilty. Fact is, they weren't read their rights. They had a right to silence. They weren't told about that. They had a right to be told that they had a right to remain silent. Those rights weren't respected. The procedures weren't followed. You can't put such a person in prison. So says the believer in, let's say, procedural justice. Now, let's imagine you're a defense attorney. That's the case we've been given. And you believe in procedural justice. And because of that, you really believe that if somebody's guilty, they still shouldn't go to prison unless the right procedures are followed. And the right procedures include giving the person the best defense that the law allows for them to get. And in the face of that, the prosecutors have to bring the right sort of evidence and the right sorts of arguments to prove whether it's beyond a reasonable doubt or whatever the level of doubt might be. You have to meet those burdens of proof as a prosecutor if you want to put this person in jail, and it needs to be met against the best defense you're able to give them. And she says, well, look, I am a defense attorney. I am playing my small role in this giant procedure, and I have to do my best job, and it's for the prosecutor to do his or her best job, and it's for the jury or the judges to do their best job. And if we all do our best jobs, says the believer in procedural justice, then we'll get the best results that we're able to get. And even if we're wrong, at least we'll be able to say the procedure was done properly, because all in all, globally, even if we get this particular case wrong, we're better off living in a state, in a society where the procedures of justice are followed as perfectly as possible. So she says, well, look, my job is to offer this guy the best defense I can give. It's somebody else's job to prove that he's guilty. And I'm worried, says this defense attorney, that if I knew that my client was guilty, I probably wouldn't be as good at doing my job as I would be. Now, if we bring in some of Kagan's terminology here, I think two things are at play. First thing is, it would cause you to be less good at your job. Okay, it would cause you to be less good at your job because, if you know in the back of your mind that what you're saying isn't true, perhaps you'll say it less convincingly. Fine. But I think it would also give you reason. Perhaps it would give you a reason to recuse yourself from the case. Say, look, I can't do this. I believe in procedural justice, but I also do believe that guilty people should be punished. So I have a reason no longer to want to defend this person, not just because I've been caused to. This is a reason. Whoever's going to defend this person would have a reason not to defend them if they knew the fact that this person was guilty. So perhaps it's better for them not to know. And I think what's interesting about this case is not only is it like the cinema case, the film case with a twist, not only is it a direct counterexample to Carnap's principle of total evidence, it's also not amenable to this idea of there being a time and a place. That's Kagan's notion. You might say about the movie, look, I do want to know what's in it. I just don't want to know what's in it before I've seen it. There's a time and a place for such knowledge. Maybe you could say such a thing. I still think it's a counterexample to Carnap, because Carnap would say, yeah, but before you make the decision whether or not you watch this movie, you should want to know all of the facts that would inform that decision. And Ullmann Margalit is, I think, right to say that that's not true. But what's interesting here about the defense attorney case is she may have a reason never to want to know. Because if she knows, even after the case, that the guy was guilty, that might undermine her confidence going forward, defending other people. Now, again, that might just be because it's caused you rather than giving you a reason not to defend people in future. But still, I think it gives her a reason to want to ignore this fact forever. If she knows that, let's say, 8 out of the 10 people that she's defended and defended successfully were actually guilty, that might undermine her confidence in procedural justice, even though she knows that procedural justice is important. So I think it's an interesting case, a case of knowledge being bad, in a sense, and being such that you should never want to know it. I'm going to start rounding off the lecture here because I don't want this to be too long. I want it to be listenable to. There is plenty more we could say, but I think it's important for us to be thinking about some of these questions as we relate to our own consumption of the news, especially in such traumatic and difficult times. It's important, and none of the philosophers that we've quoted here, Kagan, Ullmann Margalit, Carnap or Locke, would deny that we have a responsibility to be informed citizens of the world, that we shouldn't form our opinions based upon ignorance, that we shouldn't act without due deliberation of the relevant streams of evidence. And yet, having said that, we also have to recognize that there are some sorts of information which can be harmful for us. There might be images that we simply don't need to see. There may be an amount of knowledge which is reasonable to accrue, after which you can say, do you know what? I'm knowledgeable enough about this particular question, and I'm going to keep updating my knowledge as and when relevant. But there are certain gory details I don't need to know. And whether or not Carnap and Locke would agree whether or not even Kagan would agree. I think Ulman Margalit has given us plenty of reason to be a little bit skeptical about the extent to which the principle of total evidence should be respected in all times and places. Well, I hope I've given you something to think about and also some distraction from some of the terrible things around us. And I hope that in the spirit of thinking rationally and thinking clearly, we will move towards times in which the relevant powers that be will act with more reason, but also perhaps with more compassion. And that's not to say, that's not to criticize any particular player in the field. These are very complicated times. It's very difficult to know what the right thing to do is. But nonetheless, I hope that in the spirit of if we can find a spirit of wisdom and understanding, that would go a long way towards healing some of the rifts that divide the people of this land. No more to say on that topic in this particular context, but I want to wish you all the very best, and I look forward to discussing philosophy with you in happier times.
תודה שהאזנתם להרצאה מסדרת פילוסופיה בזמן מלחמה. ההרצאה עוררה מחשבה, נשמח אם תשתפו אותנו בתגובות.